Imagine a settlement so thoroughly cut off from the rest of the world that for more than 8 months out of every single year, the frozen sea surrounding it makes approach by boat completely impossible. A place so remote that even in the modern era of satellites and global communication, its few hundred residents must plan months in advance simply to receive basic supplies, access medical care, or connect with the outside world in any meaningful physical way. A place where polar bears outnumber people, where the sun disappears entirely for stretches of winter that would test the resolve of even the hardiest soul, and where the community that has chosen to remain, generation after generation, carries within it a depth of knowledge, resilience, and cultural identity that most of the world has never heard of and can barely begin to imagine. This is Ittoqqortoormiit, a small Greenlandic settlement perched on the northeastern edge of one of the most forbidding coastlines on Earth. And before we go any further into its remarkable story, if remote and extraordinary places like this one genuinely fascinate you, go ahead and hit subscribe right now, because today we are walking through exactly how life actually works for the people who call this impossibly isolated settlement home. Turn on notifications as well, because we have plenty more journeys like this one still ahead, and you will not want to miss a single one. Ittoqqortoormiit sits on the eastern coast of Greenland, tucked into the shore of Scoresby Sound, which is not just any fjord, but the largest fjord system anywhere on Earth, a vast branching network of ice-carved channels stretching hundreds of kilometers inland from the open coast. The settlement's name in Greenlandic means something along the lines of those who live in large houses, a name that connects directly back to traditional Inuit concepts of home and habitation and carries within it a quiet pride that feels entirely appropriate for a community that has chosen, generation after generation, to make its life in one of the most demanding environments found anywhere on this planet. To the south along the coast, the nearest significant settlement lies hundreds of kilometers away. To the north, the vast and almost entirely uninhabited stretch of Northeast Greenland National Park, the largest national park in the world, extends across an enormous territory of ice, rock, and Arctic wilderness. In practical terms, Ittoqqortoormiit stands essentially alone on this coast, a tiny cluster of brightly colored houses and hardy human lives pressed up against a landscape of almost incomprehensible scale and severity. Getting there at all is an exercise in understanding just how fundamentally different distance and accessibility work in the high Arctic compared to anywhere most people have ever been. There is no road connecting Ittoqqortoormiit to anywhere. There is no railway. There is no bridge or tunnel or overland route of any kind. Access comes by helicopter, operating a limited schedule that connects the settlement to the small airstrip at Nurlurit Iniat, also known as Constable Point, located some 40 kilometers away, and then beyond that to the broader world via infrequent flights connecting to Iceland and ultimately to the rest of the planet. By sea, when the ice actually retreats enough to make it possible, a supply ship arrives during the brief summer window that opens each year, delivering the bulk supplies that the community needs to survive through the long, locked-in months that follow. Outside of these narrow windows, the settlement is not simply remote in the way that many places people casually call remote actually are. It is genuinely, physically, categorically cut off, in the way that demands a completely different relationship with planning, preparation, and the management of daily life than anything most people in the connected world have ever had to consider. The sea ice that locks Ittoqqortoormiit in for the majority of the year is not incidental to the story of this place. It is the story. The ice defines the rhythm of life here, with an authority that no human institution or technology has ever fully managed to override. When the ice freezes solid across Scoresby Sound and out along the coast, typically from around October onward, and often persisting well into June or even July, the settlement enters a period of enforced self-reliance that concentrates the mind wonderfully on the essentials of survival. Food stores must be sufficient. Fuel must be adequate. Medical situations must be managed as much as possible with what is locally available. Helicopter access remains possible in principle, but weather conditions across these latitudes make even helicopter operations unreliable and sometimes impossible for days or weeks at a stretch. The community that lives here does not merely tolerate this reality. It has organized every aspect of its material culture, its social structures, its traditional knowledge, and its daily practices around this fundamental condition of periodic isolation, doing so across generations in a way that has produced a community of genuinely extraordinary competence and resilience. The population of Ittoqqortoormiit today numbers somewhere around 350 to 400 people at any given time, though this figure fluctuates with the comings and goings that characterize small, remote communities worldwide. At this scale, every resident is genuinely known to every other. There are no strangers in the street, no anonymity in the daily round of life, no possibility of the quiet invisibility that residents of larger places often take entirely for granted. In a community this small, living this far from anywhere, the social fabric is simultaneously the community's greatest source of support and one of its most delicate resources to maintain and care for across time. When things go well, the density of social connection creates a warmth and mutual support that larger, more anonymous communities rarely achieve. When tensions arise, as they inevitably do in any human community, there is nowhere else to go and no way to simply avoid the people involved, a reality that demands particular levels of maturity, patience, and skill in human relations that residents develop from childhood onward simply as a survival necessity. The Greenlandic people of Ittoqqortoormiit are descendants of the Inuit who spread across the Arctic world thousands of years ago, carrying with them a body of knowledge, technique, and cultural practice that represents arguably the most sophisticated human adaptation to extreme cold environments ever developed. The specific group whose traditions are most directly relevant to this coast are the Tunumiit, the East Greenlanders, whose cultural practices and language carry their own distinctive character, somewhat different from the West Greenlandic traditions, more broadly known through Greenland's larger coastal settlements further south and west. This distinction matters to residents and carries genuine significance in how the community understands its own identity and heritage, particularly in relation to the broader Greenlandic cultural and political landscape centered in the capital, Nuuk, thousands of kilometers away on the southwestern coast. Greenlandic, known as Kalaallisut in its West Greenlandic form, is the official language of Greenland, but in Ittoqqortoormiit, the local population speaks Tunumisut, the East Greenlandic dialect, which is distinct enough from Kalaallisut that speakers of the two varieties cannot simply understand each other without significant additional learning. Danish is also widely spoken, reflecting Greenland's status as an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, and the long history of Danish administrative and educational presence that has shaped daily life across Greenland for the past several centuries. In practice, residents of Ittoqqortoormiit navigate a genuinely multilingual daily existence, moving between Tunumisut in family and community contexts, Danish in administrative and educational settings, and increasingly Kalaallisut as well, given its status as Greenland's official language and the language of government and media produced in Nuuk. Language preservation is a genuinely live concern in the community, as it is across many small indigenous communities worldwide, facing the combined pressures of integration into broader national systems, media consumption primarily in more widely spoken languages, and the tendency of younger generations in any small community to orient toward languages that carry more economic and social utility in the wider world. Residents and community organizations in Ittoqqortoormiit are aware of these pressures and their implications for the long-term vitality of Tunumisut, and efforts to maintain the language within daily community life, in schools, in local radio programming, and in the everyday context where language lives or slowly fades, represent an ongoing, active commitment rather than anything that can be taken for granted. The traditional economy and subsistence base that sustained Inuit communities along this coast for millennia rests overwhelmingly on hunting and fishing, an orientation toward the natural world and its seasonal rhythms that remains absolutely central to daily life in Ittoqqortoormiit today, in ways that have no real parallel in most contemporary communities elsewhere in the world. This is not heritage tourism, not a recreational hobby given a traditional framing, and not a cultural performance mounted for visiting outsiders. Hunting and fishing here remain the foundation of food security, the primary source of the community's most culturally and nutritionally significant foods, and one of the most important ways that knowledge, identity, and connection to the land and sea are transmitted from older generations to younger ones. Understanding this is essential to understanding anything meaningful about how life actually works here. The animals that sustain the community span an extraordinary range of Arctic species, each associated with specific seasons, techniques, ecological knowledge, and cultural meaning. Ringed seals, the most abundant marine mammal in these waters, are hunted throughout the year, using a combination of methods adapted to different seasonal conditions, including harpooning at breathing holes in the ice during winter, shooting from small boats during the open water season, and net fishing under the ice. Bearded seals, larger and heavier than ringed seals, are also hunted when encountered and provide particularly valued quantities of fat and hide alongside their meat. Walrus, found in specific areas where ice and current conditions support their preferred habitat, represent a significant and culturally important quarry requiring skill, cooperation, and particular knowledge of where these animals concentrate at different times of year. Narwhals, the extraordinary Arctic whales whose spiraling tusks gave rise to legends of unicorns among medieval Europeans who encountered their exported tusks, arrive in Scoresby Sound during summer in numbers significant enough to represent one of the most important single hunting events of the entire year. The narwhal hunt deserves particular attention because of its profound combined significance for community food supply, economic value, and cultural meaning. When narwhals arrive in the fjord system, typically during the summer open water season, the community mobilizes in a coordinated collective effort that draws on generations of accumulated knowledge about where the animals travel, how they respond to different approaches, and how to conduct the hunt in ways that are effective, safe, and consistent with traditional values around respectful and responsible treatment of the animals being hunted. The hunt represents an opportunity to secure significant quantities of muktuk, the name for the skin and attached layer of blubber consumed raw or frozen, a food of extraordinary nutritional richness and enormous cultural significance, enjoyed with deep appreciation as one of the most important and valued foods in the community's diet. It also represents an opportunity to secure the narwhal tusks that carry significant value in international trade, regulated under wildlife protection agreements, providing a meaningful source of cash income that supplements the subsistence base and allows families to purchase the manufactured goods and supplies they cannot produce themselves. Musk oxen, the massive, prehistoric-looking Arctic bovines that range across the tundra surrounding the settlement, represent another critical component of the hunting economy, providing large quantities of meat and hides taken during winter hunting expeditions across the landscape that can extend for considerable distances from the settlement. Polar bears, both the most dangerous and the most regulated quarry available to hunters here, are subject to strict quotas negotiated between Greenlandic authorities and the hunting community, recognizing both the ecological significance of maintaining sustainable bear populations and the deep cultural importance of polar bear hunting to Inuit identity and tradition. A successful polar bear hunt remains one of the most significant achievements a hunter from Ittoqqortoormiit can accomplish, carrying status, cultural weight, and practical material value in the form of the extraordinarily warm and durable fur that has served Arctic peoples across millennia as essential cold-weather clothing. Arctic char, the cold-water fish that thrives in the river systems and coastal waters of the region, is fished throughout the year using both traditional techniques adapted to different seasonal conditions and more recent equipment, providing another important component of the community's protein supply and one that is particularly appreciated both for its excellent flavor and for the relative accessibility of fishing compared to some of the more demanding large-game hunting expeditions. Fishing through the ice during winter, using hand lines or small nets deployed through holes cut in the frozen surface, is a skill taught to children young and practiced throughout life. A quiet, patient activity that yields important food, while also providing a context for the kind of uninterrupted conversation and informal knowledge transfer between generations that close-knit communities everywhere have always depended upon. Dog sleds, once the absolute cornerstone of transportation for Inuit communities across the Arctic world, retain genuine practical importance in Ittoqqortoormiit in ways that distinguish it from many other Greenlandic communities that have transitioned almost entirely to snowmobiles. The dogs kept here, the powerful, thick-coated Greenlandic sled dogs, whose ancestry connects directly back to the dogs brought by Inuit ancestors across many centuries of Arctic travel, are working animals in the fullest sense of the word, not pets, not symbolic gestures toward tradition, but genuinely essential partners in winter hunting and travel across ice and snow. Each dog team requires significant ongoing investment of food, care, and attention, typically fed on seal meat and other products of the hunt, representing a commitment that underscores how thoroughly the different elements of traditional subsistence life interconnect with and support each other. A hunter who keeps a team of dogs must hunt successfully enough to feed them, and feeding a team requires regular hunting effort, creating an ongoing dynamic that keeps hunters actively engaged with the land and sea across the seasons. Snowmobiles are also used widely, providing faster travel across terrain and particularly useful for covering the longer distances required to reach good hunting areas or to move supplies efficiently. Most households with hunting activity maintain both options, using dogs and snowmobiles in different combinations depending on the specific requirements of a given expedition, the weather conditions, the distance involved, and the nature of the quarry being pursued. This pragmatic approach to combining traditional and modern technology characterizes much of how life is organized here more broadly, with residents making thoughtful, practical choices about which tools and methods best serve their actual needs, rather than treating tradition and modernity as categories that must be kept rigidly separate. The landscape that surrounds Ittoqqortoormiit and stretches for hundreds of kilometers in every direction is simultaneously one of the most beautiful and one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, and residents maintain a relationship with it that combines deep aesthetic appreciation, detailed practical knowledge, and a clear-eyed respect for its capacity to become lethally dangerous, with very little warning. The mountains behind the settlement rise dramatically from the shore, their slopes carved by glaciers and eroded by millennia of freeze and thaw cycles into forms of stark, angular beauty that photographers and artists who manage to visit often find difficult to capture adequately in any medium. The fjord itself, when frozen, becomes a vast white highway across which hunters travel in winter, and when open during the brief summer season, reflects the midnight sun in colors that shift through impossible gradients of gold, orange, and deep blue across the long Arctic summer nights that local residents experience with a mixture of practical complication and genuine wonder. The light itself is one of the most defining features of seasonal life in Ittoqqortoormiit, oscillating between the complete disappearance of the sun during the polar night of midwinter and the endless, disorienting brightness of the midnight sun during summer months. Polar night, the period when the sun remains entirely below the horizon, lasts roughly from late November through mid-January at this latitude, leaving the settlement in a world lit only by moonlight, starlight, the otherworldly shimmer of the aurora borealis, and whatever artificial light residents themselves provide. For those who have grown up with this rhythm, polar night is simply a feature of winter life, managed through routine, indoor social activity, maintained daily schedules that provide structure regardless of what the sky above is doing, and a cultural familiarity with darkness that shapes architecture, community gathering customs, and personal psychology in ways that outsiders can observe but rarely fully appreciate without experiencing a winter here directly. The return of the sun after polar night is celebrated with genuine, joyful communal feeling, a moment of collective relief and appreciation that connects residents directly to a human experience of seasonal cycles stretching back across all the generations who have lived in high Arctic darkness and waited for the light to return. Summer, when it arrives, transforms the landscape around the settlement almost shockingly. Ice breaks up in the fjord, water opens, vegetation on the hillsides greens briefly and vigorously during the short growing season, migratory birds arrive in remarkable abundance, and the overall texture of daily life shifts significantly as hunting and travel patterns adapt to open water conditions. Supply ships arrive with the year's essential deliveries, and the very occasional tourist appears, drawn by a combination of extreme remoteness appeal, extraordinary wildlife viewing opportunity, and the particular fascination that places this genuinely far outside ordinary experience hold for a certain kind of traveler. Summer also brings continuous daylight, the midnight sun persisting through June and July, in a brightness that never fully fades even at what the clock insists is the middle of the night, requiring residents to manage their own sleep schedules and daily rhythms with the same practical adaptability they bring to every other aspect of life, in a place where the natural environment simply does not operate according to the conventions that most of the world's population takes entirely for granted. The homes of Ittoqqortoormiit are immediately distinctive to any visitor. A cluster of brightly painted wooden houses whose vivid reds, yellows, blues, and greens stand in spectacular visual contrast against the white and gray of the surrounding ice and rock landscape. This use of bright color is not accidental or purely aesthetic. It serves the genuinely practical function of making individual buildings clearly visible against snow-covered terrain, important for navigation in conditions where visibility can drop rapidly and the ability to distinguish one's own dwelling from a distance carries real practical significance. The houses themselves are built to handle Arctic conditions, heavily insulated, designed to retain heat effectively, and elevated slightly from the ground on foundations that prevent the building's warmth from melting the permafrost beneath in ways that could destabilize the structure over time. This detail, the management of permafrost beneath buildings, represents just one of the many technical challenges that construction and infrastructure maintenance in extreme cold environments presents, requiring solutions developed specifically for conditions found in very few places anywhere in the world. Heating homes through the long, brutally cold Arctic winter represents one of the most fundamental daily practical concerns, and one where the cost and supply reliability of fuel becomes immediately life-relevant, rather than simply a budgetary consideration. Oil-based heating remains the primary heating source for most households, with fuel arriving during the summer supply window and stored in quantities sufficient to carry through the ice-locked months that follow. The cost of this fuel, calculated per liter, and then multiplied across the enormous quantities required to heat a home through an Arctic winter, is substantially higher than comparable fuel costs in more accessible locations, reflecting the logistics of delivering petroleum products to one of the most remote inhabited points on the planet. Electricity is similarly supplied through diesel generators, creating another essential dependence on the periodic supply deliveries, and adding another dimension to the community's relationship with the brief summer window when the ice retreats enough to make resupply possible. Food supply in Ittoqqortoormiit operates on a logic completely different from what residents of connected communities anywhere in the world experience. The traditional subsistence foods produced through hunting and fishing remain genuinely essential rather than optional supplements to a market-based food system, because the community's ability to receive consistent deliveries of imported food depends entirely on the same narrow logistical windows that govern every other aspect of external connection. The supply ship that arrives during summer delivers a substantial portion of the imported goods the community will rely on across the following months, including bulk dry goods, canned foods, certain dairy products with long shelf lives, manufactured goods of various kinds, and anything else the community has ordered through the systems that allow residents to request specific items from mainland suppliers. This delivery is planned months in advance, coordinated carefully to make sure that what arrives reflects actual community needs, and received with a genuine communal sense of occasion that reflects how much depends on its successful arrival. Store-bought food in Ittoqqortoormiit, like everywhere else in remote Greenland and across the Arctic more broadly, is significantly more expensive than equivalent food on the Danish mainland or in more accessible parts of the world. A simple item like fresh fruit or vegetables carries a price reflecting the extraordinary logistical chain required to bring it here, and arrives in conditions affected by travel time and handling in ways that reduce quality even when availability exists. This reality shapes the community's relationship with traditional foods in a powerfully practical as well as cultural way. Seal meat, narwhal muktuk, muskox, char, and the other products of local hunting and fishing are not simply preferred for cultural or taste reasons, though both of those things are genuinely true. They are economically rational, nutritionally dense, and logistically reliable in ways that imported alternatives simply cannot match in a community of this location and scale. A successful hunt delivers protein, fat, and micronutrients in quantities that would cost extraordinary sums to replicate through imported food purchases, while simultaneously connecting hunters and their families to the landscape, to accumulated traditional knowledge, and to the cultural identity and community relationships that form the real foundation of what makes life here feel meaningful and worth maintaining. The preparation and sharing of food functions as a primary vehicle for community cohesion in ways worth understanding in some depth. When a hunter returns successfully from a major hunt, the sharing of that food extends outward from the immediate family, according to established social patterns that distribute both the practical benefit and the social recognition of a successful hunt throughout the broader community. This is not charity and not simply generosity in the casual sense. It is a deeply embedded social institution that ensures community-wide access to important foods while simultaneously building and reinforcing the web of mutual obligation and reciprocal support that allows a small community in an extreme environment to function effectively across both good seasons and difficult ones. Elders who may no longer hunt regularly themselves receive shares from successful hunts in recognition of their status and in acknowledgement of the knowledge they have contributed to the community across decades of accumulated experience. Families who experience periods of hunting difficulty can draw on community food resources in the confidence that their own future successful hunts will be shared similarly, creating a system of distributed food security that has sustained communities in this environment across many generations. The preparation of traditional foods involves techniques developed specifically to work within the constraints and take advantage of the specific qualities of an Arctic environment. Fermentation under controlled conditions preserves certain foods across periods when fresh supply is unavailable, producing flavors and textures that are deeply appreciated by those who grew up with them and genuinely challenging for outsiders encountering them for the first time. Drying and smoking techniques applied to fish and meat extend preservation timelines without refrigeration, using wind and cold air in combination with careful preparation to produce products that last through months of storage. Natural cold storage, taking advantage of the consistently low temperatures available in excavated permafrost or in specially constructed outdoor storage facilities, serves as a highly effective preservation method that requires no energy input beyond the environment itself, which at this latitude is more than willing to cooperate in keeping food safely frozen for extended periods. The broader infrastructure of Ittoqqortoormiit, while modest by the standards of more connected communities, reflects genuine investment in ensuring a reasonable quality of life for residents who have chosen to remain in this extraordinarily challenging location. The settlement has a school providing education from early childhood through secondary level, staffed by teachers who include both local residents and professionals, posted to the community through arrangements with Greenlandic educational authorities. The school represents one of the most fundamental institutions in the community's daily life, not only providing formal education to the next generation, but functioning as a social hub and a site of ongoing negotiation between the traditional knowledge systems that have sustained life here across centuries and the modern academic curriculum that connects students to the broader educational and economic world. Children in Ittoqqortoormiit grow up navigating between these different knowledge systems from very early on, learning in school the scientific, mathematical, and linguistic foundations that formal education provides, while simultaneously learning from parents, grandparents, and other community members the hunting techniques, navigational knowledge, weather reading skills, and cultural practices that represent the community's equally sophisticated alternative curriculum. The community health clinic represents another absolutely essential piece of infrastructure, staffed by medical personnel who handle the range of health concerns arising in a population of this size and age distribution, from prenatal care through to elderly health management, alongside the injuries and acute illnesses that arise in any community. The limitations of what can be managed locally versus what requires medical evacuation to a larger facility with more specialized capability represents one of the most consequential logistical realities of life here, because a medical emergency serious enough to require specialist care triggers a chain of events entirely dependent on weather, helicopter availability, and the transportation connections to larger facilities that are not subject to the community's own direct control. This reality is something residents understand and factor into their relationship with health management in practical ways, from maintaining knowledge of which common health situations can be effectively managed at home, to ensuring that any community member facing a potentially serious health situation is assessed promptly enough to allow evacuation during whatever weather window may currently be available, rather than waiting and potentially finding that conditions have closed down travel options entirely. Mental health and psychological well-being in a community this isolated, experiencing such extremes of seasonal light and darkness, social density, and environmental challenge, represents a concern that both residents and outside researchers and health authorities have taken seriously in recent decades. The particular combination of factors present in Ittoqqortoormiit, including high levels of social stress associated with small community dynamics, the psychological impact of prolonged polar night, relative scarcity of mental health services compared to connected communities, and the stresses associated with the major social and economic transitions the community has navigated across living memory, creates a context in which mental health challenges can emerge and compound in ways that require thoughtful community-level response alongside whatever individual support can be provided. Residents discuss these realities with a frankness that reflects both their direct experience and a community-wide recognition that psychological well-being is as essential to the community's long-term functioning as any of the more tangible material resources they work hard to maintain. Substance use and its associated complications represent a challenge that Ittoqqortoormiit shares with many small, remote indigenous communities worldwide, connected to broader patterns of social stress, historical trauma, economic marginalization, and the disruption of traditional social structures that accompanied rapid change across the 20th century. Community members and local organizations work actively on these issues, in ways that combine awareness of their complexity with practical efforts to support individuals and families navigating difficulty, drawing on both traditional community resources and whatever external support can be accessed through Greenlandic health and social service systems. Conversations about these challenges in Ittoqqortoormiit tend to be direct and unsentimental, reflecting a community that cannot afford to deny the existence of difficulties that affect its small population so immediately and so visibly, and that understands addressing them effectively is simply part of the ongoing work of keeping a community of this scale and situation functioning well. Governance of Ittoqqortoormiit falls within the municipality of Sermersooq, the vast municipal unit that covers much of East Greenland, alongside the capital area around Nuuk, a geographic sprawl so enormous that the administrative connection between local communities and the municipal center involves distances and logistical complications that would seem almost absurd in more densely settled parts of the world. Greenland as a whole operates as an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, with its own government, the Naalakkersuisut, based in Nuuk and exercising extensive self-governance authority across most policy areas, while Denmark retains responsibility for certain areas including foreign affairs and defense. For residents of Ittoqqortoormiit, this layered governance structure, from local community through municipality to the Greenlandic government in Nuuk and ultimately to Denmark, means navigating relationships with multiple administrative levels, some of which feel genuinely responsive to local needs and realities, while others can feel remote, abstract, and insufficiently aware of the very specific conditions and requirements of a community this size in this location. Questions of Greenlandic independence from Denmark represent a significant ongoing conversation in Greenlandic political life, with substantial popular support within Greenland for eventual full independence, complicated by the very real economic dependencies between Greenland and Denmark that make the practical path toward independence genuinely complex. For residents of Ittoqqortoormiit, this broader political conversation intersects with very immediate practical questions about how a more self-governing or fully independent Greenland would manage the subsidies and services that make life viable in its most remote and logistically demanding communities. Small settlements like Ittoqqortoormiit depend significantly on the subsidy structures that currently flow from the Danish state through the Greenlandic government, making questions about future political arrangements consequential in ways that residents follow and discuss with the direct personal stake of people whose daily lives would be materially affected by whatever arrangements eventually emerge. The relationship between Ittoqqortoormiit and tourism is genuinely interesting and worth exploring in some depth because it involves a complicated balance between economic opportunity, community well-being, and cultural integrity that residents navigate with considerable sophistication. The settlement's extraordinary remoteness, spectacular natural setting, abundant wildlife, and genuine traditional culture make it precisely the kind of destination that attracts a specific type of traveler, typically well-resourced adventure tourists or expedition cruise passengers who have specifically sought out the world's most remote and authentic experiences after exhausting more conventional destinations. The numbers of visitors who actually reach Ittoqqortoormiit remain small by almost any standard, given the logistical difficulty and cost of getting there. But even this modest visitor flow represents an economic opportunity and a social dynamic that the community has had to consciously think about and develop positions on. Guided hunting and expedition experiences represent one of the most significant forms of tourism activity in and around the settlement, with experienced local hunters offering multi-day expeditions across the ice and through the surrounding wilderness to visitors who pay substantial amounts for the chance to travel this landscape with people who know it intimately. These guide operations provide meaningful income that can be transformative for individual families and contribute significantly to the community's cash economy, while also creating contexts in which traditional hunting and travel knowledge is exercised, validated, and in some respects transmitted to young people who participate in guiding work and learn from the process. The relationship between guide and visitor is not a simple commercial transaction in the way tourism interactions often are in more developed destinations. It is a genuinely intimate, extended engagement across challenging terrain that tends to create lasting connections and leaves many visitors with a transformed understanding of what human competence and adaptability actually look like in their fullest expression. Expedition cruise ships passing through Scoresby Sound during the brief summer season represent another dimension of visitor presence, stopping at Ittoqqortoormiit as part of broader Arctic expedition itineraries that also include wildlife observation, glacier viewing, and the general experience of traveling through one of the world's most dramatic and least disturbed coastlines. These ship visits bring groups of visitors ashore for limited periods, creating brief, concentrated interactions with the community that generate some economic activity through craft sales and similar exchanges, while also raising questions about how these fleeting contacts can be managed in ways that are genuinely respectful and beneficial, rather than simply extractive of the spectacle of a remote indigenous community for the entertainment of wealthy travelers passing through. Handicrafts produced by community members, including carved bone and antler objects incorporating traditional Inuit design elements, handmade items of fur and hide, and various other locally produced goods, represent both an expression of continuing traditional craft knowledge and a source of supplementary income for the artisans who produce them. These crafts carry genuine value both as practical objects made using techniques refined across generations of Arctic living, and as aesthetic objects whose design vocabulary reflects a cultural tradition of remarkable sophistication. The market for such items, while relatively small given the limited visitor numbers reaching the settlement, provides meaningful supplementary income and creates a context in which traditional craft skills are exercised and maintained in ways that benefit both the individual artisans and the broader cultural continuity of the community. The children growing up in Ittoqqortoormiit today inhabit a genuinely unusual position in the contemporary world, one that deserves consideration on its own terms rather than simply as a version of some more familiar story about remote childhoods. They grow up learning to read the weather from the texture of clouds and the behavior of wind in ways their grandparents learned and their parents learned before them, practical meteorological knowledge of a specificity and reliability that no smartphone weather app approaches for local conditions in this terrain. They learn from young ages how to behave safely and effectively on sea ice, understanding how to read ice conditions, identify dangerous areas, and travel across the frozen fjord with the confidence that comes from genuine taught knowledge rather than theoretical understanding. They attend school and encounter mathematics, science, literature, and the other elements of a modern curriculum, delivered in ways that connect to both the Greenlandic educational system and the broader expectations of international educational standards. Young people from Ittoqqortoormiit who wish to pursue higher education must, much like their counterparts in other extremely remote communities worldwide, leave home entirely to do so. Nuuk, Greenland's capital and largest city, offers some educational opportunities, and Denmark's universities are accessible to Greenlandic students under arrangements reflecting the existing political relationship. This departure for education is a genuinely significant transition, moving from one of the world's most remote and intimate community environments to urban settings of vastly greater scale, complexity, and anonymity, requiring adaptation across virtually every dimension of daily life simultaneously. Some young people who make this journey return to Ittoqqortoormiit after completing their education, drawn back by family, by attachment to the landscape and community they grew up in, and by the particular sense of meaning that comes from being part of a community engaged in the genuinely significant work of sustaining human life in an extreme environment. Others build lives in Nuuk or in Denmark, remaining connected to their home community through family visits and communication, while establishing themselves in the more connected world that formal education opened to them. This movement of young people creates a persistent dynamic tension between the community's need to retain enough people of working and hunting age to sustain its essential functions and the legitimate individual aspirations of young people whose education has revealed the full range of possibilities available beyond the boundaries of their extraordinary but genuinely demanding home. The elders of Ittoqqortoormiit represent the community's most irreplaceable resource, in ways that go well beyond the respect typically accorded to older generations in most cultures. These are individuals who carry within their personal memory and accumulated experience a depth of ecological, navigational, meteorological, and cultural knowledge built across lifetimes of active engagement with this specific landscape, this specific wildlife community, and this specific social environment. An elder who has hunted across Scoresby Sound for 50 or 60 years carries within their understanding a database of observations about ice conditions, animal behavior, weather patterns, and landscape features that no scientific instrument has systematically recorded and no published guidebook has documented, knowledge of a specificity and local relevance that is quite simply not available from any other source. When this knowledge is lost, through death and through the failure of transmission to younger generations, it is lost permanently, and the community's collective capacity to navigate its environment effectively diminishes in ways that cannot be straightforwardly compensated by any alternative information source. This recognition drives significant community effort around knowledge transmission, ensuring that young hunters spend time with experienced elders learning not just specific techniques, but the broader observational framework and accumulated ecological understanding that makes those techniques effective and safe in the conditions actually encountered in these waters and on this terrain. Storytelling traditions play an important role in this transmission, with accounts of particular hunts, particular weather events, particular encounters with dangerous situations, and how experienced hunters responded to them, serving as teaching narratives that transmit both specific information and more general principles of judgment and risk management in ways that formal instruction cannot fully replace. These storytelling traditions also carry deeper cultural and spiritual content, maintaining connections to the cosmological understanding and ethical frameworks around the relationship between humans and animals that have always been central to Inuit cultural life across the Arctic world. The natural world surrounding Ittoqqortoormiit is of extraordinary ecological richness and scientific significance, drawing researchers from universities and research institutions across Europe and North America who come to study everything from glaciology and climate science to marine biology and ornithology in one of the world's least disturbed large-scale ecosystems. Scoresby Sound and the surrounding Northeast Greenland National Park represent a genuinely pristine environment by the standards of the 21st century world, largely protected from the kinds of industrial development, pollution, and habitat modification that have degraded or transformed most of the world's formerly wild places. The scientific work conducted in and around the settlement creates another dimension of external relationship for the community, as researchers depend on local knowledge, logistical support, and sometimes direct field assistance from community members who know the terrain and conditions in ways that academic preparation alone cannot provide. These relationships, when managed well, create genuine mutual benefit, providing researchers with essential local expertise, while giving community members both economic return for their knowledge and contributions, and a direct sense of their essential relevance to scientific understanding of the environment they have always known and cared for. Climate change is visible and tangible in Ittoqqortoormiit in ways that are not abstract or statistical, but immediate, observable, and practically consequential for how daily life and hunting activities function year to year. Residents have observed across decades changes in ice formation and duration, alterations in the timing of seasonal transitions, shifts in the distribution and behavior of wildlife species, and changes in weather pattern reliability that affect the effectiveness of traditional ecological knowledge built on the assumption of more stable conditions. Sea ice that once formed reliably by a certain date now forms later and breaks up earlier, with implications for the length of the safe winter travel and hunting season on ice. Animal distributions shift as conditions change, requiring hunters to travel further or in different directions to find the species they are pursuing, adding logistical complexity and cost to hunting operations that already operate at the edge of what is practically manageable. These changes are observed and discussed in Ittoqqortoormiit with the directness and practical concern of people whose livelihoods and food security depend on the stability of the ecological conditions they have always worked within. Residents do not need scientific literature to tell them that their environment is changing. They can see it, have measured it empirically through decades of direct observation, and feel its practical consequences in their daily efforts to hunt, travel, and sustain their families and community through the demands of life in the high Arctic. This direct lived relationship with environmental change gives community members a perspective on climate and ecological transformation that complements scientific measurement in valuable ways, and has begun to be recognized more formally in research contexts where traditional ecological knowledge is increasingly acknowledged as a valuable data source alongside instrumental records. Social change within the community across living memory has been genuinely dramatic, encompassing the transition from a fully traditional subsistence economy to the current mixed economy that combines traditional activities with cash income from employment, tourism, and transfer payments. Alongside the shift from traditional housing and food storage to modern infrastructure, the introduction of new technologies from snowmobiles and outboard motors to satellite communications and smartphones, and the complex negotiations around cultural identity and political representation that have characterized the past several decades of Greenlandic history. Residents who are older today grew up in a world materially different from the one their grandchildren inhabit, not in the gradual, incremental ways that characterize generational change in more stable communities, but in rapid, sometimes disorienting ways that required continuous adaptation and renegotiation of what it meant to live well and live authentically in Ittoqqortoormiit, specifically, and in this Arctic environment more broadly. Despite these profound changes, or perhaps because of the way the community has navigated them, Ittoqqortoormiit retains a quality of cultural coherence and purposeful identity that observers and researchers consistently note as striking. This is not a community that has simply replaced its traditional way of life with a diminished version of modernity imported wholesale from elsewhere. It is a community that has selectively and thoughtfully integrated new tools, new economic opportunities, and new cultural influences in ways that serve the community's ongoing needs while maintaining the essential core of what makes life here distinctive, meaningful, and worth the very considerable demands it makes on those who choose to remain. The hunter who rides a snowmobile to a hunting area and then uses a traditionally constructed harpoon at the breathing hole is not being incoherent or inconsistent. He is being exactly as pragmatic and adaptive as Inuit hunters have always been, using whatever tools are available to pursue the essential work of feeding the community effectively in the conditions actually encountered. Music, dance, and traditional performance arts remain present in the community and are drawn upon for both internal celebration and cultural expression, including drum dancing traditions whose origins stretch back across the entire span of Inuit cultural history in the Arctic. The distinctive frame drum used in Inuit drum dancing, combined with vocal music incorporating styles and techniques specific to this cultural tradition, represent